What's up? Welcome back to my channel. Today we are going over Tinybones EDH. By the way, just saying that my last EDH deck tech about Lathril did pretty well. So if you want to check that out, it is on my channel. If you also want to check out more videos coming up, make sure you like this video and subscribe to this channel. This is my secondary channel. The main channel I play Modern, but this channel I usually talk about EDH and stuff. And today we're going over my Tinybones Trinket Thief EDH deck. So Tinybones Trinket Thief, 1 and a black for a 1/2. At the beginning of each end step, if an opponent discarded a card this turn, you draw a card and you lose 1 life. That's a really good ability. And then for 6 mana, each opponent with no cards in hand loses 10 life. Alright, that's also a pretty good ability. So let's talk about why we want to play Tinybones and what type of strategy we want to play Tinybones in. The commander strategy, why should you play Tinybones? Well, first, it gives you cards when opponents discard. So your spells that cause your opponents to discard cards will cause you to draw cards, replacing themselves, basically giving you card advantage. It's also built-in win con for when opponents have no hand, which, I don't know, it happens actually quite a bit with this deck where your opponents will be empty-handed, and then you could just play Tinybones and then drain your opponents out. And it's also very cheap to cast. It's only 2 mana, and of course you can cast it from your command zone for 2 mana in the late game when you have very few cards in hand, or you can you can cast it on turn 2 to start getting advantage from your discard. So there's 2 strategies that I like to employ with this deck. The first one is you can play Tinybones, cause discard, and then gain advantage from the discard throughout the game, so you're drawing cards while your opponent's discarding. Or you can discard your opponent's hands and then deploy Tinybones to drain opponents. Or, you know what, you could do both of them. You can play Tinybones, gain advantage from discarding, and then later in the game, you know, when your opponent's hands are empty and maybe you don't have Tinybones, or maybe you still have Tinybones, you can deploy it and drain your opponents. Of course, Tinybones does give you does put a big target on your head, so playing it early and doing this first ability might make you the arch enemy of the table. However, it is a really powerful card, so if you're able just to rip cards out of people's hands, maybe it doesn't even matter if you're the arch enemy. But the second strategy will make you less likely to be the arch enemy, but it's going to be more difficult. But of course, you can just do both in conjunction. So first of all, we want some repeated discard in this deck. Here's are some examples of repeated discard. These are not every card in the deck that's repeated discard. I actually have a deck list in the description below if you want to check that out. We have cards like Liliana of the Veil. It's +1. Each player discards a card. So now each player is discarding a card. You draw a card if you have Tinybones out. Pretty darn good. And then you can also use it to make someone sacrifice a creature. But one cool thing about Liliana of the Veil is that if you ultimate it, you can just basically kill a lot of players' permanents. So it's basically a built-in win con too. A bottomless pit. During each player's upkeep, that player discards a card at random. I like this at random thing, so they can always, with most of your cards like Liliana, they choose what to discard, but bottomless pit makes them discard at random. Now, it does make you discard at random too, which kind of sucks, but having your opponents discard at random is really cool because, you know, it's going to really fuck up their strategies more than just them discarding what they want. And then lastly, you have cards like Cunning Lethemancer. At the beginning of your upkeep, each player discards a card. So this will only trigger Tinybones once, while cards like Bottomless Pit will trigger it multiple times. However, Cunning Lethemancer, still really good. Still really good effect to make your opponents discard cards. Now, you have to discard a card too, but if you have Tinybones or some other advantage card out, you're going to be drawing cards. So these are repeated ways to make your opponents discard cards. We also have Stax discard. So these are sort of discard effects that are not reoccurring, but they happen every time something happens, and they really hurt your opponents. So Oppression is a good example of this. 1 black. When a player plays a spell, that player discards a card from his or her hand. So Oppression, if you play Oppression, anybody casts a spell, well, now they're losing at least 1 card. Now this applies to you too, so that kind of sucks. But if you're gaining advantage off of your opponent's discarding cards, and you already have ways for your opponent's discard cards on the table, this might keep your opponent from casting spells, or might make it so that your opponent basically gets empty-handed very quickly. And then Painful Quandary. 3 black black. Whenever an opponent casts a spell, that player loses 5 life unless they discard a card. So this is less mean than Oppression, because in Commander, people have 40 life, so most people are just going to choose to lose 5 life, but this really stacks up over the game. And of course, if your opponents are light-handed, they're going to choose to lose 5 life, and then, you know, losing 5 life every time you cast a spell is going to add up, and they're going to eventually die to that or a Tinybones trigger. So these are examples of Stax discard that are in the deck. We also have spells that discard. So Siphon Mind is one of my favorite spells to discard. 3 and a black. Each other player discards a card. You draw a card for each card discarded this way. So you get to trigger Tinybones. You get to remove cards from people's hands. But you draw 3 cards, which is really good. So this gives you card advantage plus discard, which is what you really need in this deck to keep on discarding cards from your opponent's hands and keep on filling those symmetrical effects like Oppression so that you're not also dying to your own discard. Arterial Flow, each opponent discards 2 cards. Okay, easy. Cards like this that affect each opponent are really cool. There's ones that say each player discards 2 cards. Arterial Flow is one of the better ones because it says each opponent discards 2 cards. Then we have Dark Deal. Each player discards all the cards in his or her hand and draws that many cards -1. It's not very good for getting cards out of your opponent's hands, but getting discard triggers, this is very good at. And then also, if an opponent has a big hand or opponent tutored for something, you can really fuck them over with something like a Dark Deal. Whereas these ones, they'll just keep it in their hand. Well, Dark Deal, oh, now you're forced to discard your whole hand. It doesn't matter if you search for something good. Oh, it's all gone. And, you know, you're also going to be drawing cards. So this can really be an interesting card because it's like a mono black wheel. I mean, it is a mono black wheel. It's the only wheel that mono black has, and it's a really good way of disrupting your opponents if they tutor things into their hand. If they have a large hand size, you're getting a lot of discard triggers, and you're going to be drawing from it as well. Everyone's going to be drawing from it, but if you have Tinybones out or another effect out that draws you cards from discard, Dark Deal works really well with that. So yeah, these are some examples of spells that discard in the deck. Creatures who discard are really good because not only will they come in and cause your opponents to discard or have an effect that causes your opponents to discard, but they'll be able to block your opponent's attackers because, like I said, you're going to be an arch enemy of the table, especially if you have Tinybones as your commander. So these will be able to block your opponent's things and also be able to threaten your opponent's planeswalkers if there's any. So cards like Elderfang Disciple, 1 and a black. When enters, each opponent discards a card. There's so many of these in this deck. Just really good way making your opponent discard cards from their hand and then also adding things to the board to help protect you. Stronghold Rats, and there's a couple other cards like this. Whenever it deals combat damage to a player, each player discards a card. So things like this are repeated discard on a creature. Now, it can be removed pretty easily, but something like this comes in, and if it's not answered, your opponent's discarding every single turn from this, which is really strong. And then you have cards like Nezumi Shortfang, which have an activated ability, which makes your opponent's discard. So Nezumi Shortfang, 1 and a black, tap, target opponent discards a card. Then if that player has no cards in hand, you flip it. So this is a way to make opponents discard cards. So if someone has more cards in hand, maybe you want them to discard a card. If someone has exactly 1 card in hand, you might want them to discard a card. So cards like this, and also the Raven Man, allow you to activate ability to discard a card, but really the strongest ones are the ones that discard when they enter the battlefield or when they deal combat damage. Although, if your opponent has a lot of blockers and there's really no good attack, something like a Nezumi Shortfang that has activated ability can be a lot better than something like Stronghold Rats. And then we have cards that draw cards when your opponents discard cards, and this is the way that you get card advantage out of your opponent's discarding cards. So something like a Silent Visitor is very good. 1 and a black. At the beginning of each player's upkeep, if that player has no cards in hand, you draw a card and you lose 1 life. So if you're able to actually get your opponents to have no cards in hand, then you'll be able to actually gain card advantage from that, which is really cool. I like a Silent Visitor a lot. Yeah, if your opponent just have no cards in hand, you deploy this, and now you're getting a lot of cards. This happens before they draw too, by the way. Gef's Grimoire, probably one of the better cards in the deck. 4 mana. Whenever an opponent discards a card from his or her hand, you may draw a card. It's also a May, so you can't deck yourself out with this. But something like this is really powerful. So you play Gef's Grimoire and you play any discard spell. Not only are you making your opponents discard cards with this, but you're drawing cards, so you're getting card advantage to allow you to find your win cons or allow you to find more discard spells. And then one of my favorite things one of my favorite cards in the deck, Court of Ambition. 2 black black. When it enters the battlefield, you become the monarch, so you'll be gaining a card after you play this at your end step, which is really cool. You don't have to wait a whole turn or anything like Phyrexian Arena. And then it says at the beginning of your upkeep, each opponent loses 3 life unless they discard a card, so they're probably going to lose 3 life. But if you're the monarch, instead each opponent loses 6 life unless they discard 2 cards. So this comes in, whoever's next, they're going to have to discard 2 cards or lose 6 life, which is a big decision, kind of like Painful Quandary. If they lose 6 life too many times, then this is going to be game over for them. So yeah, but everyone's going to be attacking you if you play something like Court of Ambition to try to gain the Monarch, which is why these creatures who discard are very important, because something like Elderfang Disciple can block your opponent's attacks. And next we have cards that get you value from your opponent's discarding. So you can get value in the form of card advantage, or you can get value in the form of other ways. Something like Tourach, whenever an opponent sacrifices a non-token permanent or discards a permanent card, you may put that card from a graveyard on a battlefield under your control. This is like insane. So you play this, anytime someone discards, you get to just steal their permanent. Something like this will just end the game a lot of times in conjunction with discard spells. Waste Not is a lot cheaper. And it gives you a lot of value. It's not game-winning value like Turgid, but Waste Not, it'll come in whenever an opponent discards a creature card, you make a 2/2. So that's really good at blocking your opponents and also threatening your opponents. Whenever an opponent discards a land card, you add black, black, which, I mean, is not that great. That's probably the worst one on here, unless you were like actively looking for more mana to do something, or you have something you can activate at instant speed, like one of those rats. And then whenever an opponent discards a non-creature, non-land card, draw cards. That's probably the best ability on this. So Waste Not, whenever an opponent discards certain cards, you get advantage in different ways. One of the strongest cards in the deck, and it's only 2 mana, which is really, really cool. And then you have the Raven Man. At the beginning of each end step, if a player discarded a card this turn, you make a 1/1 bird. Now these birds can't block, which is really sad, so your opponents can still attack you, but the Raven Man makes you 1/1s that can threaten your opponents, and especially with your Stax effects like Painful Quandary or the Monarch, the one Court of Ambition we talked about. Your opponents might be at a low life total, so you can use these 1/1s that you get from making them discard to actually kill them. So the Raven Man, interesting card in this deck, and also has activated ability where it causes each opponent to discard a card, so that's pretty strong. But anyways, these cards give you value from discarding cards. And then you have your discard win cons. Here's are some examples in the deck. The deck has more. Like I said, each one of these examples there's more of. I couldn't fit 15 discard spells on the screen, but if you want to look at them, you can look at them. There's deck list in the description below. Here's some examples of win cons in this deck. Quest for the Nihil Stone, 1 black enchantment. Whenever an opponent discards a card, which will happen a lot, you get a quest counter. And then at the beginning of each opponent's upkeep, if that player has no cards in hand and it has 2 or more quest counters, which is going to be easy, you may have that player lose 5 life. So if someone's empty-handed, you play this out, well, they're going to lose 5 life at their upkeep, which, pretty good. Pretty good Stax effect. It's a really good way to kill them quickly. The rack is similar, but the rack doesn't, they don't have to be empty-handed. You choose an opponent, actually. It's kind of worse than multiplayer, but it's still pretty good, I think. You choose an opponent, so it's not as good as Quest for a Nihil Stone, but at the beginning of each of chosen player's upkeep, the rack deals X damage to player X is 3 minus the number of cards in his or her hand. So if they have 2 cards in hand, it'll deal 1 damage to them. If they have 2 cards, it'll deal, or 2, yeah, 2 it'll deal 1. 1 it'll deal 2, and if they have no cards, it'll deal 3 damage to them on their upkeep. So this is a really quick way of being able to drain someone's life out, but it's only 1 player, so it's not as good as something like Quest for a Nihil Stone, but it's still pretty darn good. You can use this to target whoever the strongest player is or whoever is closest to dying. And then one of the best discard outlets, probably one of the best discard win cons in the deck, is the Leona's Caress. There's also Megrim that does the same thing. 1 in a black, whenever an opponent discards a card, that player loses 2 life. So this is very good with your discard effects, because now your opponents are losing life in addition to discarding. So now there's actually some pressure on them. And then It says whenever an opponent discards a card. So that means every time you have an effect that causes it, it happens. So you play your spells, you play your creatures, you have your repeated discard. They're going to lose 2 life every time that happens, which is really, really great. Actually, I think this also happens in multiples too. So if you have like Dark Deal and you cause your opponent to discard like 4 cards, they lose 8 life, which is really, really powerful. I love cards like Liliana's Caress. Yeah, you play Liliana's Caress on turn 2, Dark Deal on turn 3, everyone loses like 10 life, or all of your opponents lose 10 life. Yeah, that's pretty strong. That's pretty strong. And this can win the game pretty easily. And we're doing a lot of damage to our opponent with cards like these. So these, of course, if you have multiple copies of these, you can win with just one Liliana's Crest, but you have a Liliana's Crest and a Quest and a Migrum. You'll be able to just drain your opponent out very quickly. Before I want to go to the last slide, I want to talk about removal in this deck. This deck plays quite a bit of like targeted removal, but I think the best type of removal for a discard deck is going to be sweepers, because sweepers will allow you to get card advantage and be able to kill multiple creatures that threaten you. So something like Damnation or Decree of Pain will be the best removal for this deck. I didn't have a slide for the removal. I don't know why. I just didn't think it was that important, but this deck does play a lot of removal and a lot of sweepers if you look in the description for the deck. The last thing I want to talk about is alternate commanders. Now, Tinybones, people don't like Tinybones because Tinybones is very strong. And these are 2 cards that are legendary creatures in the deck that actually cost the same mana cost as Tinybones. They're also pretty good commanders for this deck. So if your opponents, your opponents are going to get salty at Tinybones and you don't want to be the target of your opponent's like wrath, then maybe you can just play like the Raven Man or Tourach so that no one targets you. Because if you play the Raven Man, people are going to be like, oh, okay, that's not as good of a deck, right? But it's the same deck, just a different commander. So you can purposely power down your deck and make it less good so people don't see you as much of a target. The Raven Man is not as good as Tinybones, but at the beginning of each end step, if a player discarded a card this turn, you make a 1/1. So now that the Raven Man, you play discard, and now you can make these 1/1 birds that can actually threaten your opponent's life total, and you're going to be making a lot of them because you're going to be causing a lot of discard with your repeated discard and your discard spells. And then you have something like Tourach, which has pro-white, which is relevant because it can't be swords, it can't be generous gifted, it can't be solituded, can't be pathed, so it's pretty relevant actually. It can kicker, and you can pay that from the command zone to make target opponent discard 2 cards at random, which is pretty nice from the command zone. But whenever an opponent discards a card, you put a 1/1 counter on it. And what this really does is it turns your deck from just a discard deck into a discard Voltron deck, which is a little cool. This deck does play Swiftfoot Boots and Lightning Greaves to protect the Tinybones. So if you play Tourach, for instance, you can play Tourach, cause your opponents to discard a card, and then possibly win by commander damage as a different way of winning. So these give you alternate commanders to the deck for 2 reasons. 1, if you want a different play style from the command zone. 2, if you don't want to be the target. And 3, if you want to try a different strategy. The Raven Man gives you a strategy of making creatures. The Raven Man turns you into a discard token deck, and Tourach turns you into a discard Voltron deck, which is really cool. I like both these commanders. But the main commander of this deck is Tinybones. These are just like the optional alternate commanders. I think Tinybones is the best discard commander in mono black, and I think these are secondary commanders. But I did want to talk about them. Anyways, this is the end of the video. If you like this video, make sure you press the like button. Let me know what you think about this deck below. There is a deck list in the description if you want to check out the full deck. And make sure you subscribe to this channel and share this video. Thank you very much. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.